PC-1.
Welcome back to the Columbia studio. We are at this time. This is shuttle control.
And holding. We have been holding now for approximately 45 minutes and have approximately 16 minutes remaining in the time before we would have to realign the IMUs. We have been told by Houston that they're extremely stable and we may be able to extend the hold slightly beyond what is normally contemplated. At the present time, we have not had a reading as to how we're listening now to Houston, where they are talking about what may be the possible problem that caused the backup software to look as though it might not be satisfactory. But at the present time, we do not have a determination as to how long we may hold at this particular point. There has to be a decision in the near future as to whether to go back to a different point in the countdown. But at the present time, we're at T-minus 9 minutes and holding. This is shuttle launch control.
So a quick interpretation of what all that means. At T-minus 9 minutes before the launch, the hold was instigated, caused by, we believe, a fault in a computer system on board Columbia, which was indicating excess water production from fuel cell number 3. They think it's a computer problem, not a systems problem. Let's have the latest news now from Kieran Prendeville at the Cape.
Hello, Mike. Well,
Kieran.
As you've just heard, they've been holding now for about 45 minutes instead of the scheduled 10 minutes. There is a concern, incidentally, from the people watching the fuel cells that there was too much of a load put on them, and they've switched back to sharing that with the ground system. It's all rather a pity. After the excitement of the last couple of days, there's rather a pall of gloom that's settled over Cape Canaveral at the moment. We're all waiting for news as you are, and as soon as we have something, we'll get back to you.
So, hardly surprising, we hear from Kieran Prendeville that the atmosphere at the Cape is somewhat gloomy at this time. By this time, Columbia should have been in her first orbit. She's not. She's still sitting on the pad. After so many delays, what frustration at this time. Jeffrey, have we reached the stage, or are we reaching it, where there might now be a long delay on this attempted launch?
No, we have about 14 minutes left, even on the present assessment, but the platform, which is this critical thing, this base on which they determine where they are, appears to be so stable that they may be able to hold it longer than that. It's very ironic that it is the software, in other words, the measuring and the controlling thing, which appears to be wrong rather than the units themselves. But I think we are talking simply a question of delay. I don't see anything at the moment suggesting that they are finding anything in the system which is fundamentally wrong. Once you have to start getting screwdrivers out and changing hardware, that's when your problems come. So I think we're talking of minutes or even possibly fractions of an hour rather than anything catastrophic. But we shall know, obviously, when they finally determine this fifth computer and what situation it really is in.
Do we have anything new from launch control?
Doing this, it only takes us back to minus 20.
So they proceed with their frantic efforts to put matters right. It seemed that we were approaching a deadline at 1:30, where a fundamental decision would have to be made. But from what you're saying and what we were picking up from Houston and the Cape, they might be able to extend this temporary hold, if I can put it that way, without having to cycle back to some 50 minutes before launch.
That's right, and indeed they can't say themselves at the moment because this platform is behaving so well. It's a very good sign for the future, in fact, that the future in terms of the flight itself, that the main equipment is holding up so well. So we're really in the software, the actual information part of the system rather than the hardware part.
We're talking about the information system. I wonder how the two fellows who are actually flying the thing, or hope to fly, are feeling now. I wonder if Kieran at the Cape has had any chance to either talk with the astronauts or their colleagues. What does he feel they will be thinking now? Kieran at the Cape.
Well, you can make your own stab at guessing what must be going through the minds of the two astronauts, squatting on top of 500,000 gallons of liquid propellant and 1,000 tons of solid rocket fuel. Now, incredibly enough, their heart rate just before we came on air was absolutely normal, according to NASA. I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as whether that's the case now. Incidentally, there were a few minor hitches this morning before this latest one. There was a blown fuse in one of the fuel pumps And then shortly after that, a leak in a feed line from the hydrogen storage tank. That's not the external tank, that's the storage tank which fuels it. Still, those faults were quickly put right. This one we're hoping will be put right, though not obviously as quickly. I'm afraid we don't yet have any more information about that.
Kieran, thank you very much at the Cape. So I fear slight gloom and despondency from Cape Canaveral. Columbia still on the launch pad now, 40 minutes after her scheduled departure. Back to regular programs now. We will be continuing to monitor the progress of Columbia, or lack of it, and when there is something to report, then rest assured we will be back with you here in the Columbia studio. Until then, that's it from us here.
For longer than 6 hours, and do not want to have them awake between the time that they're awakened and the time they have their first sleep period in space longer than 20 hours.
We're listening now to shuttle control at Kennedy, where the news is that Columbia is still on the ground. The clock has been cycled back to T-minus 20, which in effect means that they're going to have to realign the inertial measurement units on board the spacecraft to make sure that if she does lift off in the reasonably near future, she will go into the right trajectory. But no decision has been taken on whether or not a launch is imminent. With the latest news, live from the Cape, here's Kieran Prendeville.
Yes, hello. The news from Cape Canaveral is that we are now at T-minus 20 minutes and holding. The countdown clock was put back from T-minus 9 after Mission Control decided that they couldn't hold the clock at that time any longer. Now, we have another problem as well, apart from the inertial measurement unit. That's the thing which controls the pre-flight alignment of the shuttle, which direction and attitude the shuttle takes off in. We've got another problem as well, and that's the weather, because although the weather around the shuttle stack looks pretty good, we've got some cloud coming in, and the winds are picking up as well. Now, there are a number of limiting conditions about the weather. The center of cumulus nimbus, that's cloud system, should be no closer than 5 miles from the launch pad. The headwinds at the return to launch site runway should be no greater than 30 knots. Now, what that actually means is that if they should have to abort the mission after they took off and return very quickly to the Kennedy Space Center here at the Cape, then conditions must be okay for them to land, which is why, of course, they don't want any headwinds on that runway. Now, it's not too bad at the moment, but as I say, the wind is picking up a bit. Crosswinds again, they should be no greater than 15 knots. And finally, there's a problem about the crew themselves, because they got up at 2 o'clock this morning, and the doctors reckon that they really shouldn't stay in a horizontal position in that shuttle very much longer. If it goes on much longer than this, the doctors will probably say, look, we'll have to take the boys out and try again another time. Anyway, that's just speculation for the moment. We don't have any definite information, and like you, we're waiting here for more news.
Kieran, many thanks. So it doesn't look good at the moment from Columbia. The crew have a time limit on their availability, the weather is closing in, and there is still the problem with the software in that computer system. So, not desperately good news from the Columbia studio, but thanks to our colleagues at Pebble Mill for their patience. Back, for the moment, to you. Welcome back to the Columbia studio, where, as you can see, the spacecraft is still on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, and within the last few minutes we have heard that it is unlikely now that there will be a launch within the next hour and a half. But for the news in detail, this is the announcement that Spaceflight Control made just a few minutes ago.
This is Shuttle Launch Control at T-minus 20 minutes and holding. At the present time, the launch team and launch director George Page are discussing the beginning of the inertial measurement unit pre-alignment. Once we start the pre-alignment, the earliest that the launch could take place would be approximately 81 minutes from that point. If we should not be able to go today, it probably would be necessary to recycle until at least Sunday. One of the constraints in the preparation of the vehicle calls for a 24-hour conditioning period for the liquid hydrogen tank once we have filled it with hydrogen and then drained it again. If we stick to that conditioning criteria, we would not be able to make the beginning of the window tomorrow. At the present time, a discussion is going on as to how soon we can start the pre-flight alignment to give us a chance for a launch today. During that period when we're doing the pre-flight alignment, which takes 51 minutes, and then transitioning to the launch, the final launch ground programs, it would take approximately 81 minutes from that point before a launch could occur. What we're hoping will happen is that during that period, a determination will be made of how to solve the problem with the backup computer not communicating properly with the four ascent computers. At the present time, the program from the backup computer is being analyzed and run on comparison systems at Houston to try and determine whether it is proper. So we're standing by to begin a realignment of the inertial measurement unit at the T-minus 20-minute point in the count and holding. This is shuttle launch control.
So that is the latest news from Kennedy, and just to interpret briefly, that means they haven't solved the computer problem yet, and they are recycling all the other pre-launch procedures, which means that we're unlikely to see a launch today before 4 o'clock our time at the earliest, which would still be within the window for a launch today. So we are still in with a chance. With the latest news from the Cape, here's Kieran Prenderville.
Hello, Mike. Yes, as you might have gathered from the tone of Launch Control's voice, a certain amount of resignation has set in here at the Cape. There were a great many people around earlier, and there are not so many now. You may find this hard to believe, but it's estimated that something over 1 million people were packing the Cape Canaveral area to watch this launch, whoever it is that makes those kind of estimates. Rumours were flying around as well that a host of Hollywood stars were going to turn up too. Names like Bo Derek, John Denver, and even Gregory Peck were being bandied around freely. Well, whatever about them, I certainly haven't seen them. And those people that were standing around looking at the space shuttle waiting for the launch decided instead to go and take a tour around the huge Saturn V rocket here at Kennedy Space Center. They even had a picnic table out there, and now I see that they've taken that up and even they've gone. So I'm afraid it is a little depressing here. Obviously, if anything does happen, we'll be back to you as soon as it does.
Thank you, Kieran. Well, even though there is gloom and despondency amongst the team at NASA, there's a spark of life left in our Kieran. We, of course, will be back to him if there's any news. Jeffrey Pardo here in the Columbia studio. How do you interpret what has been happening in these unfortunate minutes?
Well, of course, the irony of this thing is that it's not a piece of hardware, something tangible. It's the information content, it's the actual software, the program of the computer. We are caught up with progress in that sense because these computers are now so powerful with such capacity that the more information, the more functions that you have, the longer it takes to clear them through. And this is the problem of building
by our own petard.
We are indeed.
Jeffrey Pardo, thank you for that. We'll stay in touch with Columbia throughout the afternoon and back as the news breaks. Meanwhile, on with the regular programming.
aboard the Columbia, they may go
without it. And the countdown is on. Both the crew, John Young and Bob Crippen, are keen to go, though the doctors haven't been so happy about them being cooped up so long. We'll keep you posted. That ends this news of the shuttle.
Progress of the launching of the American Space Shuttle.
Good afternoon to you from the Columbia studio, and the news is that the American shuttle will not go today. Disappointing news indeed, because up to 11 minutes ago it did appear that the problems which had dogged the launch at its scheduled time of 10 minutes to 1 this afternoon had been put right, things had been reorganized for a launch just 10 minutes from now. Then, 11 minutes ago, we heard the news that the initial problem with the computer system had not been sorted out, and that the much-troubled American Space Shuttle will stay on the ground for at least the next 48 hours. This is how we heard the news from Shuttle Launch Control at Kennedy Space Center. We heard that Columbia was not going to fly today.
The launch director, George Page, and center director, Dick Smith, have just announced that we will scrub the launch attempt for today. We will stop the clock probably at the T-minus 9-minute point and send out a crew to open the hatch of the orbiter and take the crew back to the astronaut quarters. The earliest time in which we could possibly reschedule the launch will be for Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. What this is dependent on, of course, is resolution of the problem which we have had in today's launch attempt. That problem has not been traced to whether it is strictly a software problem or whether it's possibly has something to do with the hardware. What has occurred has been that there are 5 flight computers on board the orbiter. The normal configuration for a launch is that 4 of them are programmed for the ascent run, and the 5th has a backup program in it. Each time as we went down the countdown, there was an inability of the backup computer to communicate properly with the other 4 general-purpose computers. We have attempted to check out the program. The program that was in the backup computer was the proper program, the one that we had planned to put there. However, what that does not say is whether there is some problem that is in that program which is not understood at this moment. In any case, we have to recycle, and we'll have a determination probably later today as to whether to reschedule for Sunday. The reason that Sunday would be the earliest possible time we could schedule for has to do with the conditioning of the liquid hydrogen tank in the external tank. This is the tank which supplies the fuel to the main engines on the orbiter. The liquid hydrogen which is placed in the tank is a very, very cold, minus 423 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In order to ensure that there be no damage to the metal in the tank, there has to be at least a 24-hour conditioning period after the liquid hydrogen is drained from that tank before liquid hydrogen can again be placed in it. Since we are this late in the launch window at this time, it will not be possible to drain that and then have the proper conditioning period and then reload it in time to schedule a launch for tomorrow. So at the present time, we have terminated our launch attempt for today and will reschedule for no earlier than Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is Shuttle Launch Control.
So that's the sad news, recorded just 10 minutes or so ago, that Columbia will not lift off. In fact, news is coming through all the time of what is happening at the Cape. So let's go live now to Cape Canaveral and the hopefully reasonably cheerful voice of Kieran Prendeville.
Hello, Michael. Yes, we are out of the game this time. The earliest launch will now have to be Sunday because, as you heard, they can't possibly empty the external fuel tank and refill it in less than 48 hours. The problem was with the backup computer on the shuttle orbiter, which wasn't talking any sense to the other four. It's perhaps interesting that the company which programmed the software for the fifth computer is a different company from that which programmed the other four. So whether that has any significance, I can't say. Now, as that fifth computer is supposed to be backstop for the other four, that is, NASA felt there was no way they could launch. And with so much at stake here, in particular the lives of two astronauts, well, that's not too hard to understand. Mike.
Kieran, thank you very much indeed. Kieran Prendeville stirring it up a little bit at the Cape, but the sad news is no launch today and no likelihood of any launch for at least 48 hours. Well, waiting patiently with me here in the studio in the United Kingdom has been Geoffrey Pardo. Geoffrey, disappointing for all of us, I think.
Well, it is disappointing, of course. I think it's an interesting point that we are suffering, the shuttle people are suffering from the advance in technology in a strange way. Each of these computers is capable of handling hundreds of thousands of pieces of information, storing it, memorizing it, and acting on it. Now, the value of a computer is that it can, in fact, do these things remarkably rapidly in millionths of a second. But we come to the point, of course, that it takes a human being to program it in. And if you get a situation such as this, where there is some apparent fault within the software of it, then incredibly you cannot speed up the human mind to instantly scan what is then several millions of different combinations to sort it out. So whilst it all goes well, fine, we have no problem, but we have a classical situation now where we are buried within and dependent on the technology. It's the same sort of problem I think we see in the use of computers in a more domestic environment.
When technology is so sophisticated, it's impossible to tell quickly where the fault is lying.
Well, that's right, and now they have to go back to a slower sort of, not just a manual examination, but nevertheless they now have to look at the thing piecemeal. And of course the other thing is this point that Kieran just made, that the computers are programmed by a different company. I don't think necessarily this shouldn't be a fundamental problem, because essentially they are putting in instructions and they are putting in data which should be compatible. I think the thing which, if anything, surprises me, it's the fact that it took this time into a few minutes from liftoff, virtually, to find that there was some sort of apparent incompatibility.
Well, let's go back briefly over the day's events. We got to T-9 in the original count about 20 to 1 this afternoon, and the problem arose, and initially it looked as if it was a problem in a fuel cell, something within the system of the spacecraft itself.
That's right. And at that point it wasn't clear, of course, whether the sensor which was saying what was wrong was at fault, or whether the computer scanning this was at fault. It's still possible that the computer had a bit of a problem associated with that. I say possible, but not probable, because later we heard that the odds may have been that they were somewhat overloading the demand on that one of the 3 fuel cells, which of course produce the main electricity. But because it's coupled into the ground facilities at this time, then of course they should or could have had an ability not to load the spacecraft fuel cells too much, but to rely more on the power from the main site. Now that appears to have been cleared up satisfactorily, and then of course we got to this other thing. So there's just a very small possibility the two may be connected in some way. I think it's more likely that there was some unfound situation in the actual computer programming so far, which for some incredible reason didn't show up till right this last moment.
It is surprising, isn't it?
It is a little bit.
And then what they had to do was take the entire computer program in number 5, the backup computer, and run it through some system at Houston.
Well, there were 2 things to be done at that point. Firstly, was there a wrong program in this 5th backup computer? Now that may sound rather incredible, but in fact computer programs are being modified the whole time, and over the years gradually they perfect the instructions as well as the data stored in it. So the first thing was to dump, so-called, the information out and compare it with the master banks as to what it should be doing. This took, as we know, the best part of half an hour or so, and then they found that apparently it was the right program. Now this, in a way, was rather disappointing, because had they found that there was some small piece of information wrong, it would have been much easier to correct it at that time. So now we have the irony of the program being correct, the other 4 programs being correct in the main computers, and this inability to check with each other and communicate between these computers. Now here we have, of course, the slight possibility, as they said in that announcement, that there may be some small part of the electronic circuitry at fault. Then that is a problem, because you can't change the circuitry, then you've got to change the computer. Now, okay, in the 48 hours, it's certainly physically possible to plug it in and out, but that's why they're now busily working on, is it hardware, is it software, and how does it gear back to the whole of the hardware?
So the shuttle, which has had a tough history over so many years, is having a tough time even in the build-up to its launch.
That's
Geoffrey,
right.
Let's wait for a second or two. Let's put a hold into this one at this stage and go live to the Cape again to get the latest from Kieran.
Hello, Mike. Yes, Cape Canaveral is now echoing to the sounds of a circus leaving town. Trailers are being hitched up and driven out as thousands of reporters from all over the world try and rebook the hotel rooms they checked out of earlier today. I suppose the only bit of good news I can give you is that you may remember that earlier I was wondering where Bo Derek and Gregory Peck and all the rest of the Hollywood stars were that were supposed to be here. Well, I'm now informed by a reliable source that Clint Eastwood has been frustrated along with the rest of us here, as well as Angie Dickinson, Pat Boone and John Denver. I can even tell you that the governor of Florida was playing baseball in front of the grandstand. So at least someone was having a nice time. Back to you, mate.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you very much indeed. Let's have one quick word from Geoffrey. How quickly could they possibly get this system back on the road again? Is 48 hours realistic?
Yes, it's possible. It depends very much as to whether they find there's some fundamental reprogramming. They couldn't reprogram the whole thing in that time, but I think there's a very good chance that, given a few hours, not under the pressures, as it were, which they certainly have at the present moment, they can determine it. I mean, it's not as if it's starting from scratch, no question of that at all. But the key thing is to find out why it happened. Then I think there's a very good chance with the facilities available to really move in and get things ready for launch in 2 days.
So 48 hours is not out of the question?
Not out of the question at all,
Indeed.
no.
Geoffrey Pardo, many thanks indeed. So there it is, the sad news. Columbia will not make her launch date. Indeed, her schedule has been a tricky one ever since she was first conceived. Let's end this first programme, because indeed we'll keep you posted throughout the project as best we can as to what is happening, and when the great event does take place, we will be there to cover it. But let's hear once again the news from Space Center Control at Cape Canaveral in Florida, which told us that today the American Space Shuttle was going to stay on the ground.
The launch director, George Page, and center director, Dick Smith, have just announced that we will scrub the launch attempt for today. We will stop the clock probably at the T-minus 9-minute point and send out a crew to open the hatch of the orbiter and take the crew back to the astronaut quarters. The earliest time in which we could possibly reschedule the launch will be for Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. What this is dependent on, of course, is resolution of the problem which we have had in today's launch attempt. That problem has not been traced to whether it is strictly a software problem or whether it's possibly has something to do with the hardware. What has occurred has been that there are 5 flight computers on board the orbiter. This is shuttle launch control.
American Space Shuttle is still on the ground. 2 attempts
At blast-off today had to be stopped because of last-minute problems. And now it'll be Sunday before there's another chance to send the shuttle, Columbia, and astronauts John Young and Bob Crippen into space. The first delay happened only 9 minutes before blast-off was due. Mission Control stopped the countdown because of a battery fault and trouble with the computer. The countdown was restarted only to be called off again just over an hour ago. The computer was still going wrong. Well, by that time, the astronauts had spent nearly 6 hours lying on their backs in the cockpit. They must have been very glad about the sandwiches they had zipped into their spacesuits. The day began for them with a breakfast of steak and oranges and no hint of the troubles that were to come. After getting into their suits, they got ready to climb aboard Columbia for the first American manned mission into space for 6 years, a mission dangerous in every way. Then, from the control room, flashed the dramatic message that the countdown had been stopped, and teams of troubleshooting scientists tried in vain to sort out the problems. Meanwhile, Columbia waited on the launch pad. The shuttle project was already nearly 3 years behind schedule, and this dramatic delay at the most vital moment of all must have been heartbreaking for everyone involved. Well, our space editor, Reg Turnell, should be on the phone right now from Cape Canaveral. Hello, Reg, are you there?
Yes, John.
Reg, what are the prospects now for it going on Sunday?
Well, not really very good for getting a repeat of this perfect weather, but a consolation, of course, is that Sunday will be the 20th anniversary of Gagarin's first ever space flight. A good omen, perhaps.
Reg, they must have been very pleased that it was nothing that was seriously wrong with the shuttle.
Yes, I suppose so, but all the same, the astronauts were terribly disappointed, and Launch Control has just been apologizing profusely to them for the mess-up. John Young replied dryly, "What a pity on such a lovely day."
Yes, it really is. It really is a pity. Is everybody terribly disappointed, Reg?
Yes, I think there's a lot of criticism growing here because this computer program which went wrong should not have gone wrong. It had not been played through the simulators, which is a quite astonishing thing. There's going to be a big row about it.
Reg, thank you very much indeed. We'll see what happens on Sunday. And thanks very much. That's all from us.
The space shuttle remains earthbound all day after running into problems. Blast-off for the astronauts won't now be until Sunday at the earliest. Good evening. Today's launch of America's space shuttle has been cancelled. Just over an hour ago, the flight director and his deputy at mission headquarters in Houston decided that they couldn't solve a problem with the craft's computers. So they've been forced to remove the astronauts, John Young and Bob Crippen, from the orbiter and postpone the whole launch until lunchtime on Sunday at the earliest. Here's our science correspondent, David Wilson, in our shuttle studio.
It's a computer problem that's kept shuttle on the ground. Shuttle's much more heavily dependent on computers than the older space machines. In fact, it carries 5 computers. They're situated just in front of the main cockpit control panel. 4 of these computers are actually in control of the flight, but they're all connected to a 5th backup computer. The 4 active computers were all programmed by one giant American computer company. The backup computer was programmed by a different company. And what they found today was that the computers wouldn't talk to each other. Now, the launch has had to be postponed for 48 hours. This is because they'll have to unload all that fuel, and they can't get it back and settle down properly for 48 hours. So it's been a story of fluctuating fortunes. The day began peacefully with a calm and glamorous sunrise, which spelt fine weather for the launch. The 2 astronauts were up before the sun and tucked into a hearty and solid breakfast. And this was to turn out a very wise move because they were to have a long wait before their next meal. And then they had to get dressed in their new style flying suits, which are much more comfortable and flexible than the old Apollo suits. They appeared confident and cheerful. Throughout the early stages of the countdown, the ground crews had very little to worry about, and only the smallest of hitches. The astronauts crawled into the orbiter at the start of what turned out to be a 6-hour vigil. The real trouble only appeared 20 minutes before launch, when they heard there was a computer problem which was baffling the scientists.
It has been determined that one portion of that computer program has never been run before in the simulations which have been conducted, and that is presently being looked at very hard. It is being put through the facilities in Houston which determine whether or not the computer programs are valid.
Then the agonizing wait began, while scientists and computer experts at Cape Canaveral and at Houston struggled with the problem. They couldn't find the answer before it was necessary to get the astronauts out of that cockpit, though ironically it's in the cockpit that the troublesome computers are situated. Just half an hour ago, first Crippen and then Young came out of Columbia. They'd been in there for more than 6 hours, and they looked distinctly tired and warm.
Good evening. The first flight of America's space shuttle has had to be put off. It's been grounded by a computer fault.
Now Sunday is the earliest they can try again. The astronauts, Bob Crippen and John Young, stepped out of the Columbia spacecraft a short time ago after 5 frustrating hours of trying to sort out the fault. Doctors had been getting concerned about them. They'd got to within 9 minutes of blastoff before the countdown stopped when Crippen spotted the fault. Mission Control battled against the clock to try to find out what had gone wrong. Then finally the announcement they'd all hoped they wouldn't have to make.
The launch director, George Page, and center director, Dick Smith, have just announced that we will scrub the launch attempt for today. We will stop the clock probably at the T-minus 9-minute point and send out a crew to open the hatch of the orbiter and take the crew back to the astronaut quarters. The earliest time in which we could possibly reschedule the launch will be for Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m.
No hint of trouble when astronauts Young and Crippen were woken for breakfast just after 2 in the morning local time. They'd been reassured that all systems on the orbiter Columbia were working perfectly. So, over a breakfast of steak and eggs, Commander John Young confidently raised his coffee cup to toast a successful launch. 50-year-old Young is the veteran of 4 previous flights. For his fellow pilot, Bob Crippen, aged 43, today's launch would have been his first. Breakfast over, the astronauts kitted up in their pressurized flying suits that would have been needed had they been required to eject from Columbia in a sudden emergency. There was a handshake for technicians who, Young and Crippen, hoped they wouldn't be seeing again until after their return to the Cape, after their successful 54-hour mission and a landing in California. And at 5 o'clock local time, Young and Crippen clambered on board the shuttle to make final preparations for blastoff. The countdown appeared to be going smoothly as daylight broke over the Cape. The weather was perfect, and an estimated 1 million spectators had gathered at vantage points around the launch site. And with 9 minutes officially left of the countdown, things seemed to be going well. Then came the first problem.
We do have a problem which we're working at the present time. We have had a light come on, which is a red line indication that the pH level in fuel cell 3 is at an improper level. At the present time, that problem is being analyzed to determine whether or not to pick up the count at the normal time, whether there is a fix that has to occur, or what is the next course of action.
One of the fuel cells that provide electricity for the shuttle was showing a malfunction. It was a problem NASA engineers quickly solved. But then came a second devastating blow. The shuttle's backup computer, one of 5 on board the orbiter, was refusing to exchange any information with any of the others. Frantic efforts by the astronauts and mission controllers couldn't put it right. Under basic mission rules, there was no alternative but to cancel today's launch. So it was a couple of very disappointed astronauts who emerged from the shuttle after a tense 6 hours and 10 minutes strapped in their ejection seats, waiting for conditions to be right to go. They'll now try again on Sunday. Norman Reese, ITN, at the Kennedy Space Center.
Well, with me is the American astronaut Dave Scott, who blasted off to the moon in Apollo 15 from this same launch pad, 39A, in 1971. Dave, how will those 2 astronauts be feeling now?
Well, a bit disappointed, having gotten that close and all that work. Well, it's sort of tough to have to recycle and go back, but they're professionals, and they know what the problems are, and they understand the reasons.
Well, what effect will it have on them, lying virtually, if not entirely upside down, certainly with their legs above their heads for 6 hours and 10 minutes?
Oh, I think that has no really permanent effect. It's an uncomfortable feeling after so long, but as soon as they get up and walk around, they'll feel fine.
But it said the doctors were concerned about them.
Well, the doctors have to be concerned because they're part of the system. You know, the whole total spacecraft and the pilots and the crew are a very important system, and the doctors must ensure that when it launches the man, that part of the system is in as good a shape as possible.
Well, obviously the computers today weren't in as good a shape as possible. Why do they play such a key role in a manned spacecraft?
Well, because this particular spacecraft has so much capability that it can only be handled by a large brain, if you will, a computer. And we build redundancy in it so that if one fails during flight, we have an opportunity to switch to some others. There are 5 aboard, in fact, but it's called quad redundant, so there's 4 redundant computers. The controls are operated by the computer, the systems on board the spacecraft by the computers, many things because it's so sophisticated and complicated, but at the same time so capable of doing so many things in orbit.
But the men have ultimately to control those computers.
Oh yes, the men ultimately control the computers, but the computer is the link between the hand of the man and the controls, for instance.
Will they have any problem in getting back up to peak to take off on Sunday?
No, I think these men are professionals and they've been test pilots and they understand, you know, that things like this will happen and they'll have themselves geared up again, ready to go on Sunday, I'm sure.
Dave Scott, thank you very much indeed. Let's hope you're right. And President Reagan himself is having tests to see if he can come out of hospital tomorrow. That's 13 days after he was shot.
The trip to London Zoo was once one of the most popular days out in Britain. Now the zoo's facing hard times. The public are staying away and the losses are mounting up. Is the zoo an endangered species? That's the London programme, tonight at 11.
This is London Weekend Television, broadcasting from our studios on the South Bank.
Columbia stays on Earth, it may get up on Sunday. The IRA man wins the by-election. Poland's Prime Minister gives an ultimatum. President Reagan may go home tomorrow. And Graham Gooch has been laying about him. Good evening. The Space Shuttle Columbia, which ought to have been orbiting the Earth tonight, is still on its launch pad at Cape Canaveral. It could go up at Sunday lunchtime, but they have not corrected the fault yet. It's a computer fault. One of the 5 computers on board is not in touch with the others. Now, it may be that it's not properly synchronized, but they're not sure. And when it went wrong twice today, that was that. Officials admitted later that they had not run a full test program in trials with the computers on board. From the Cape, Norma Reese.
It had been a warm, cloudless night on the Cape, and all systems on the floodlit Columbia were working perfectly when astronauts Young and Crippen were woken just after 4 in the morning local time. So, over a meal of steak and eggs, Flight Commander John Young confidently raised his coffee cup to toast a successful first launch. Breakfast over, the astronauts kitted up in their pressurized flying suits, suits that would have been needed had they been required to eject from Columbia in a sudden emergency. 50-year-old Young is the veteran of 4 previous space flights. For fellow pilot Bob Crippen, aged 43, today's launch would have been his first. Before entering the shuttle, there was a last personal word with some NASA technicians, people the astronauts hoped they wouldn't be seeing again until their return to the Cape after a successful 54 hours in orbit and a landing in California. As daylight broke over the Space Center, the countdown was going smoothly. Weather conditions were ideal, and roads for miles round were lined with cars as an estimated 1 million people converged on vantage points to view the launch. With the countdown on hold and 9 minutes left, everything seemed set to go. Then came a problem with the fuel cells that provide the shuttle's electricity. That one was quickly put right. But shortly afterwards came the second and what proved to be the critical setback. Trouble with a backup computer, one of 5 on board the orbiter.
This is shuttle launch control at T-minus 9 minutes and holding. At the present time, we are in the process of dumping the program which is in the backup flight computer. It's called the backup flight software, and are going to re-enter that program into the computer. We had thought that this particular problem had gone away, but apparently it had not.
The backup computer on Columbia was refusing to exchange information with the other onboard computers. It was a phenomenon space engineers had never encountered before. One of them said later, it made our screens light up like a Christmas tree. As the delay continued, a second launch time was scheduled 3.5 hours later than planned. The astronauts and mission controllers tried everything they knew to put things right, but it was obvious the problem was refusing to go away.
We're all agreed that the probability that this is going to clear it up is not really that great. It might be that it will, but we're not heavily confident. Okay, we understand.
Reporters and cameramen from around the world, most of whom had been here all night, caught a nap or just waited to be told what would happen next. NASA's top officials held a final conference among themselves and reluctantly concluded that the launch would have to be postponed.
The launch director, George Page, and Center Director Dick Smith have just announced that we will scrub the launch attempt for today. We will stop the clock probably at the T-minus 9-minute point and send out a crew to open the hatch of the orbiter and take the crew back to the astronaut quarters. The earliest time in which we could possibly reschedule the launch will be for Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. What this is dependent on, of course, is resolution of the problem which we have had in today's launch attempt.
So the countdown clock has stopped here at the Kennedy Space Center, and tracing the problem that caused it to halt could well cause delays that extend beyond Sunday. Scientists here are making no secret of the fact that they find the whole situation extremely puzzling and that they cannot yet agree, even amongst themselves, about what exactly is wrong.
We've all got our own pet theories about what's going on here. Probably the one you hear the most, and it's just a theory, we haven't proven this yet, and of course we're in the process trying to figure out a way to prove it or disprove it, is that we got a timing skew that we have never seen before between the pass and the backup in the way they were transferring information. Now, to give you an idea of how tight the window is, we have a 5-millisecond window that backup computer has got to get an instruction from the primary set to listen on all 4 of the flight critical buses.
So, after 6 hours, 10 minutes on board Columbia, astronauts Young and Crippen emerged not in the way and certainly not in the place they intended. Now they wait to see when they can try again. Norman Reese, News at 10 at the Kennedy Space Center.
And now David Scott, who flew in Apollo 9 and landed on the moon with Apollo 15, and who's been listening to NASA all day. Just how bad a black eye is it?
Black eye? I think it's not a black eye, Stuart. As a matter of fact, I think people need to realize that this is an experimental flight, and this is the first time that this very sophisticated piece of machinery has actually progressed right down to the launch point. And I believe it demonstrates not only the vigor of the country, but our scientific strength and our technological expertise, and the fact that we have an open society in which everybody can watch everything we do. So you have to realize that it's not the days of mature Apollo systems. It's an experimental flight, and we expect to have some surprises. We had one today, but I'm sure they'll recover.
Now, are you surprised that it seems that the computer program wasn't fully tested with the computers on board?
Well, yes, I am. I'm surprised in one way, but not in another. Again, not until the day of the actual launch do you get to do everything that you do on the day of the actual launch. And if we look back at the past, Apollo 14 had a computer problem just before it went down to land, and even Apollo 11, if we remember, Neil Armstrong had a computer problem just before he landed. So we have seen these surprises before. They're surprises. I am surprised that it happened, but on the other hand, with the complex machinery we have, I'm not surprised that an experimental flight like this has a little problem.
Now, do you think it could be a long delay?
It's hard to tell. You know, we're hearing a number of opinions, and it's very difficult. It could be a long delay. On the other hand, somebody tonight might find the solution, and it would go as planned on Sunday.
Now, the crew said that they weren't heavily confident about the flight. That was late on this afternoon. What does a stop like this do to morale?
Well, Of course, it's very disappointing for them today, having been geared up and ready to go on this precise day and everything going so well. But we'll find that they'll fall back and regroup, if you will, and get their enthusiasm up again, and tomorrow morning they'd be ready to go just as they were today.
Now, hasn't the whole shuttle program been dogged by disappointment over the years?
Well, again, I'd like to emphasize the fact that this is an experimental program and that the things that happen are publicized widely. If we were to do this in secret, you'd never hear of anything until it launched. It hasn't been dogged by any problems more than other experimental programs. As a matter of fact, I would say that it's been more successful than Apollo in its development.
Thank you very much, Sandy.